I was looking for web design inspiration, and I've always really liked the design language of Luma, which is a generative AI company. And while I was checking the page for completely unrelated stuff, I just suddenly saw the trailer of different AI videos people have created from prompts in Luma, and one with those glass flowers immediately caught my eye. I felt like I need to know how to make something like that in Blender. So unlike the AI version, it will actually be controllable. We can use it in whichever scenes we want, and hopefully we learn a lot of useful stuff, which, a spoiler, is true. So the general approach of remaking something is to do the most important stuff first. On the reference, I see two important things. I can see the lighting, I can see the shape of the flower. Now we cannot work on lighting before the shape, so obviously let's do the shape first. And the flower is quite organic. The best way to do organic things is to sculpt. So we need a base mesh that kind of looks like the flower. And for that, I just added a circle, extruded it, essentially a cylinder, and added a remesh modifier. So it becomes this dense thing that you can easily sculpt. And then I added a tiny geometry node setup that blurs the position of each point. And this smooths the disk very nicely. So we have this kind of a flat pancake that we can start sculpting from. Again, let's do the most important stuff first, and let's start with a large overall shape of it, and then gradually move to more and more detailed, because this approach makes sure you have space for the next iteration and gives you better results. Kind of as you build walls before painting them, you also build the overall flower shape before making like small crevices on the surface. So just spend some time on it, make some crazy stuff. I really enjoyed that. In the end, we got this flower, and pretty good result, I think. With the inner petals, this technical artist side in me kind of became prominent, which means, in other words, I became lazy. I took the entire shape and just scaled it down, scaled on the z-axis, and rotated a little bit. And yeah, that's the inside of the flower. And for the small dusty things inside the flower, which are apparently called stamens, I just took a Bezier curve, added some thickness to it, duplicated it like 6-7 times, and there we go. So perfect, the flower is ready. So now we have this shape. Let's get to the next step, which is making the material, which actually makes it magical. So if you look at the reference, we can see a couple things. First, we can see that the material is made of glass. So that's a pretty freaking solid thing to know. It's glass. Then the next thing, it has some luminescence or some glow to it. So that's like two things already. And then the third thing is those intense colorful reflections. And those three things make up the flower. So let's get to it. The first thing that we need is to add something behind our flower, because glass, as you know, is transparent, and to get the full idea of how the glass material looks, we need something behind it. So now let's add the material to all the meshes that we have here. So I'm going to select the main flower with the shader editor, add a new thing called glass, select actually all of the objects, make sure not the base, and do Control L, link materials. And now all of them have the same material. Hopefully, let's see if we change the color. Does it work? Yes, it does. It is a glass material, so we're gonna increase the transmission. And if you look at the reference, we can see that the reflections and refractions are much sharper on the reference. So to accomplish that, this means the glass is less rough. So we're gonna decrease the roughness to like, well, you might be tempted to go to 0. But the thing with roughness 0 is that it looks very cheap. It's so CG. So I'm going to use 0.1 here, which adds a little bit more like definition and visibility to some areas of the flower that don't have such strong reflections. So if you compare with or without, you can see there is a pretty big difference. The flower on the reference is also a bit blue. So let's add some blue tint. Looks pretty nice. Now, the next biggest thing that this flower is missing is luminescence, because the world around the flower seems to be pretty dark. So if we, use the dark world, you can see we don't really see the flower. But on the reference, we do see them because they are glowing from the inside. Now, we can either add a light inside of the flower, but this has a problem, because on the reference, you can see that the glow of the flower is differently colored in different areas of the flower. So if you want to, for example, have on the inside to be purple, on the outside of the glow to be a little bit more greenish, then with lights it's pretty hard to do. But if you actually put it into the shader of the glass, make the glass itself glow, then we have control over every single surface point of the flower, and therefore we can create whichever surface glows we want. So let's do that in shaders instead, because lights don't give us the control we need. And when remaking AI stuff, we here have the control. So let's go to the emission, and we can see here we have the color option, which by itself does nothing unless accompanied by the strength. So we enable the strength, but that's pretty bad because we don't want the entire flower to glow, we want only the center. So let's think about it in a technical way. That's where I step in. So how do we translate this into a rule? We can do so that the closer the surface point is to the center of the flower, this yellow dot right here, the brighter it glows, and the further away it is, the less it glows. So let's do that. First, we need to know where each point is, and for that we can just take a picture coordinate node, and we can preview the object coordinates of each surface point. What it actually means is that it's a color, and the red channel is encoding the X position of each point, and the green channel is encoding the Y position of each point, and the Z is, well, the blue channel and Z are also the same. So if I, for example, separate this into different things, you can see, X, Y, and Z position. Dark values are small values or even negative, and the brighter it gets, the further away it gets from the center of the object. Now this material is currently on all of the objects, so this means the center will be different for all of the objects. As you can see, it looks a little bit different because it takes into account the rotation and all that stuff. So let's define this main flower, biggest one here instead. And now this is our basis. So whenever we use this material, it's going to use this flower's origin as the center point. Okay, so we know that, and now we just need to calculate how far is this position from point 0. And you can see we have a gradient like that. Now this gradient is problematic because it has small values in the center, has large values on the outside. We want them to be in the inside. So what we need to do is to invert this gradient. So let's take a map range node. This node allows us to map a range of values to a different range. So from previously, if, for example, the value gradient, let's say, was going from 0 to 1, we can tell using this node, instead go from 0 to 1 that way. So what used to be 0 is now 1, and what used to be 1 is now 0. So what used to be 0 will be now 1. What used to be 1 will be now 0. Bam, this is how it works. I know sometimes people make it look like it's a complicated node, but it's not. It's actually pretty easy. So you invert the range, and let's test it out already. So I'm going to put this into the strength and preview it, and you can see, well, that's pretty cool. But obviously we want the center of the flower to glow and not the edges so much, looking at the reference. So let's adjust it instead. And looking at our arrows, what we want is not what used to be 1 to be 0, but instead we want, for example, what used to be 0.5 to be the new 0 right here. So if you type in here 0.5, you can see it becomes half as small. Well, this already looks amazing, let's be honest. But if you look at the reference, it has some colors. How do we add the colors? Well, for that, we need a color gradient. Well, of course, if you want just one color, you can do it here. You can put it red, you can blue, any color you actually want. Those look pretty cool. But the more variants you add, generally, the more interesting things look. So let's take the color ramp. And from this same gradients that we have here. So what the color ramp does is when the factor is at 0, when the input here is at 0, it uses this color. So for example, it uses blue, and when the factor is at 1, we'll use the red, for example. And now if you connect this here, you can see the values here are 0 on the outside here and 1 in the center. So this means in the center it will be red, in the edges it will be blue. Yes, this is the correct way. Yep, I told you the correct way. This is how it looks, and combined with the shader and the strength, I would say it's already better. But I mean, if you look at the reference, you can see that the glow is more like a white in the center and gets like purpley. So what we can do is this is for the edges and this is for the center. So the center we can make almost white, and then the edges we can make a little bit like beige, purpley, or whatever, and make it more concentrated, maybe a little bit smoother, and yeah, something like that. So this goes more along with the reference. And it looks good from some angles like this one, but from the top, it looks bland as hell. So what we need to fix this is first understand why it looks good from the edge, why it looks bad from the top. It looks bad from the top because you can see this undetailed bland glow in the center, whereas from the side, you see a lot of different reflections, refractions. It looks very cool. We don't have this when looking at any other angle really. Even here, it looks kind of boring. So what we're going to use is ray depth. Like that's pretty cool. I just discovered it with this project. You know, it makes a difference. So let's take the light bath, not the bath, but path, and go down to the ray depth. Now you don't see, well, you actually do see something, but what this output actually gives you is the more the ray bounces inside of the glass, the higher of a number it gets to itself, kind of like an attribute. So okay, so if the ray is directly into the camera, it has the bounce 0. If it has done something like a small reflection, like a small refraction, it hasn't the number 1. If it has gone really far away inside of the glass, done a lot of bouncing, gets back to the camera, it's like 10 or maybe even more. You know, the maximum number is actually under light paths in your project, and you can see max bounces transmission 12. So at max you will have 12 out of here. And why I think it's so cool is that we can artificially increase the brightness of reflections inside of the glass as they progress. So I'm going to take a math node and I'm going to, well, if I add something here, you can see the brightness gets brighter or not. If I multiply with something, the same story. But if I now take the ray depth and I plug this into the multiply, you can see how it just immediately gets more vibrant, more cool. You just, you know, before, after, before, after. That's because, you know, especially on the edges here, you can see that the more the light goes inside of the glass, the more visible it gets, the brighter it gets. And if you look from the top, I would say the difference is pretty big. Also look at the reflections down here. You can see it looks just beautiful. Turn it off, it's like blur. But if I enable it, awesome. And that's it for the luminescence. Now the last thing that will really make this flower pop, will really make a difference, is the colorful intense reflections. How we're gonna add them are two ways. So the first is on the surface of the, or like part of the shader itself. And the second part is part of the environment. So we're going to make the environment more interesting, kind of create the custom HDR that makes all of those reflections for us. The first thing is going to be on the surface. So to get some colorful stuff on the surface that really looking at the reference is like all sorts of different colors, what we can do is use thin film. So we're going to go to thin film, and if you increase this in nanometers, it kind of adds this layer on top of the glass. Yeah, for example, here, it already looks just gorgeous. Like before, 530, you know, this adds this layer of kind of oil on the surface that when reflecting light makes certain wavelengths more amplified and therefore adds more color to it. So I like this 630 here, which adds a little bit of that blue. And if you look at it, I mean, we got our colors. I think this looks pretty cool. But now the next thing that we need is the actual reflections from the environment. So let's do that. I'm going to go to the world tab here and turn the background to all the way black. And this is how our flower looks. As you can see, not much of reflections. So let's do so that we create a custom HDR made of small dots dispersed in our world that are very bright and colorful and reflect on the surface of the flower. Let's take a noise texture and let's first create the locations where we want to have those dots. So I'm going to Control T, have this noise texture around us like that. And I'm gonna turn the detail to like 4 and then take a map range as I like to use and map the range to, have a lot of contrast, something like that. And if you slide them both at the same time, you can kinda create those dots around the world that will reflect from the surface of the flower. Now, as you can see, they do reflect, but they are very weak. So instead of doing 0 to 1 as the end gradient, let's do like 0 to, 50. Aha, okay, we got some reflections. I'm gonna hide the plane because this one doesn't help us anymore. And you can see, well, this adds those nice dots here. This looks kind of horrible, but we can do better. So the first thing that we need is colors, of course, because they are all white. And the second thing is adding more detail on the actual glass, which we're gonna do in a quick way as well. So for the colors, take another noise texture and you can use the same, same coordinates, and you're gonna tune it down to like 2 and decrease the scale to maybe the detail down as well, because the less detail, the faster the noise renders. And now I'm gonna take a color ramp. From the reference, we can see that the reflections are mainly warmish and also some blue stuff there. So I'm gonna use red and blue, some tints of red and blue here. So first I'm gonna use the blue and then I'm gonna use the tone of red, something like that. So as you can see now the world looks like that. And what we're gonna do is set the map range back to 1 actually, and use a mix color node. And we're gonna use the map range as the factor. So now this maps between 2 different colors, but we're gonna map between the black or complete darkness and this colored version. And because those 2 noises have, very different patterns, some of those dots end up being blue and some of those dots end up being red. And they all contribute to the reflections on that flower, which are already looking pretty cool. So we're gonna take this color and plug it to the background and make the strength of it like 50 something. And look at that. I mean, that's my respect to this material. This really looks good. You can play around with them however you wish. These are the final parameters of my setup, and I'm gonna make them a little bit larger. So maybe you wanna use the same. But now what we need is, well, looking at the reference, this kind of looks like AI slop, which is the first thing you obviously noticed. We want to do a little bit better than this AI here. We want to add a little bit more detail, because this part of the flower, I mean, it looks very bland if you look from the top. So what we're going to do is we go back to the object material, to the glass here, and we're going to add some bump to the glass to actually make it look more detailed. And since the flower is radially symmetrical, like a starfish, we can use a clever math trick to make it look much, much better. So we're going to take a noise texture and put the noise texture into the, into a bump node. So I'm going to take a bump node, plug it to the height, and preview the bump. And as you can see, this is kind of how it looks. If you increase the distance, you get something. Okay, looks interesting, but this really isn't related to the flower at all. So if we now do something like that and plug it into the normal, well, it will look more detailed for sure, but also it looks very cheap. We want to avoid that, and instead we want to map the noise in a radially symmetrical way. How we can do that is using a separate XYZ. So we're going to separate the X and the Y of, we can do also from this object here, the X and the Y of this shader. We don't need the Z. And we're going to use a math node and a math operation called arctangent2. Plug the X and Y inside. Doesn't matter the order. One of them is apparently more correct, but I don't really care. We just need that gradient. So what this gradient is, if I'm going to use, for example, a greater than node, you can see this creates a math gradient like that. And we can plug this into the noise, and this makes this noise radially symmetrical. But the noise actually needs 2 components. So one of them is going to go clockwise around this flower, and I'm going to delete the things we actually don't need. So one of them is going clockwise around this flower, and the other one is the distance from the center, the other component. So I'm going to add a combine XYZ to actually make a vector that this noise needs. One of them goes to the X. What goes to the Y? Well, into the Y goes pretty much we can just use this distance here. So now you can see we have more detail to the noise, and we can multiply either one of those components using a vector math node, for example, to get a more stretched noise on one direction, or to get it more stretched on another direction. Good. So now if you preview the bump, we can see it is much more related to the flower, although it's very cheaply done. And actually, to make it even more related to the flower or flow better with the geometry, use a thing called, just use the mix node, mix color, set it to the vector mode, and mix in here some of the normals of the texture coordinate. Very sloppy, very incorrect, but I mean, works. You can see it just bends the things kind of based on the geometry somehow. So instead of doing like full blow like that, add a little bit, like maybe 0.1. I think that's pretty good. And maybe the scale should be 10. And maybe the factor should be a little bit less, because it can get cheap this way as well. So nothing is safe from getting cheap. And if you preview it now, you can see, okay, that's better, but it's also super strong. So let's turn it down. Let's do 0.25. And if you look at the glass, you can see it has much more detail as compared of going without. You know, that's cheap. That's much more professional. So you can, of course, play around with the settings as much as you want. These were my final settings for bump mapping here. And then in the sheen here, I'm just going to add a tiny bit as well, just to make it have a little bit more of surface definition. So without sheen, it is a bit more transparent. With sheen, which is kind of like fine dust, it looks a bit better. And ladies and gentlemen, this is the flower. So the thing is, I have a cool trick as well to show you when you're putting together a scene with this flower. So usually when you have a thing made of many parts, you are kind of tied to joining them to instance them around. But instead we can use geometry nodes to make something much cooler. So I'm just going to add a random object. This is going to be like I'm going to call it the host of this flower. It's going to host the flower. And I'm going to go to geometry nodes. Then the rest of this flower, I'm going to add into its own collection called flower. Then to the host, I'm going to drag in that collection and plug it here. So now we have an instance of this collection, but we keep the different objects, this hierarchy here. So we don't really have to join them together and lock in. Maybe you want to change something. This is also an instance, so you can add however many of those, and you don't add geometry to your scene. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, these are the flowers. I hope you liked some tips and tricks you got from here. And if you like this little geometry nodes trick we did at the end, I have a course which teaches exactly things like that. How do you make tools? How do you make geometry nodes practical? For example, a better array that instances and avoids overlaps, and also a row generator, cables on curves, and so on. The course is 10 hours of lessons, and when there's a new topic, the lesson also has text recaps that explain the theory in more detail. Then there's 20 quizzes that fry you deep, and of course a comment section where you can ask for help. At badnormals.com, check it out. And I guess that's about it. See ya!